Good evening. I call to order the virtual study session of the Lakewood City Council on Monday, August 5th, 2024 at 7 p.m. To connect to the council meeting, please use one of the following links at lakewoodspeaks.org or lakewood.org/council videos. For online public comments, you may post comments of any link to lakewoodspeaks.org, an online forum for public comments. We are leaving online public comment open during the study session and through 10 a.m. tomorrow morning for any comments related to tonight's presentation. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Strom is absent. Mayor Pro Tem Sharzai.
Here.
Councilors Cruz, LeBure.
Here.
Lowe.
Here.
Mayak Guerrero. Nystrom.
Here.
Olver.
Here.
Ryan.
Here.
Sinks.
Here.
Stewart.
Here.
And I'll check again for Councilors Cruz or Mayak. Oh, great. Thank you. And Mayak Guerrero. Maybe not on the call at this time. Mayor Pro Tem, you have a quorum.
Thank you. We'll now move to item 3 on our agenda, and I'll defer to Paul Rice, Development Assistance Manager and Planning Commission Chair Kip Kolkmeyer, to introduce this topic. And Chair Kolkmeyer will provide a brief presentation and be available to answer questions about the recommendation.
Paul, would you like me to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to either we could do that or we could start with the video.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mayor Pro Tem and members of the City Council. We do have a video that summarizes these recommendations. And Mr. Rob, if we could roll that, and then I'll have just a couple of additional comments and take your questions.
Good evening. I'm Kip Kolkmeyer, the chair of the Lakewood Planning Commission, and tonight we're presenting the Planning Commission's recommendations regarding proposed amendments to the Lakewood zoning ordinance governing fueling stations and car washes. The City Council asked the Planning Commission to consider whether there should be additional requirements regarding the approval of new fueling stations and car washes because of potential health and environmental impacts from these particular uses. Following the City Council's request in January of 2024, the Planning Commission accepted public comments on 3 separate hearing dates. The Planning Commission specifically encouraged representatives of fueling station and car wash industries, as well as environmental groups, to provide expert testimony. Ultimately, the Planning Commission's recommendations we're presenting tonight were unanimously approved in February of 2024. The first thing the Planning Commission did was review the current ordinance requirements regarding approval of new fueling stations. Currently, they are only allowed as a special use in 4 zone districts, and an applicant must meet the existing supplemental standards required by 17.4.3.1M. Under this section, no new fueling station may be approved if it is to be located within 1,000 feet of an existing fueling station, with the exception of a circumstance where the traffic conditions prevent access to that existing station. In reviewing the requirements placed on new car washes, they are only allowed as limited use in an MG zone district and as permitted uses in 3 other districts. There are currently no supplemental standards requiring separation of existing and new car washes. The Planning Commission heard testimony and received evidence of the health and environmental harm from fueling stations and car washes. Fueling stations cause significant adverse health effects from the off-gassing of hydrocarbons, which have been linked to increase in cancer cases. Fueling stations and petroleum fuel vehicles clearly contribute to the poor air quality throughout Lakewood and the broader region. And there was specific evidence about the adverse health effects from fueling stations near residential uses that support greater separation of fueling stations from residences. In addition to the adverse health effects from air pollution, fueling stations and car washes also result in significant water contamination, and car washes adversely affect water conservation efforts. An additional problem with car washes is the noise that results from the use of commercial vacuum systems. Fueling stations and car washes, generally speaking, were found to be inconsistent with zoning districts designed to promote mass transit, pedestrian travel, and cycling access. From a land use planning perspective, these proposed recommendations are both timely and urgent. The transition from petroleum to electric vehicle use is analogous to the dramatic and rapid transition from horse use to automobile use in the urban environment from 1910 to 1929. The Planning Commission also heard persuasive evidence that within 10 years, 80% of all fueling stations will be unprofitable, creating the likelihood of stranded assets that will need environmental remediation. Environmental remediation of a fueling station on average costs $250,000 per station. The Planning Commission is recommending that fueling stations no longer be allowed in the mixed-use neighborhood and mixed-use general zoning districts. Both of these districts are designed to primarily be for pedestrian activity serving the immediate neighborhood where pedestrian and cycling activity is accommodated and encouraged. Also, with the information regarding the cumulative and even exponential effects on health, Planning Commission recommends that they be separated from residential uses and that we further encourage the requirements regarding electric vehicle charging. Similarly, the Planning Commission is recommending that car washes not be allowed in the mixed-use general zone district, and that where it is allowed in the other three districts, it be treated as a special use permit. Finally, we recommend adding an additional supplemental standard for separation of new car washes from existing car washes. Thank you for your consideration of these recommendations, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Mayor Pro Tem, I just had a couple of additional comments to make, if that's all right. Thank you. After the recommendations had been approved, Mr. Rice, as clerk to the Planning Commission, did some additional research that I think is very helpful to also share. Currently in Lakewood, we have 52 gas stations and 27 large standalone car washes, as well as dozens of car washes that are attached to fueling stations themselves. Interestingly, if you look at the map, most gas stations are a mere 6 blocks apart, and the farthest we could find was about 18 blocks from one gas station to another. Just want to highlight again that study from the Boston Consulting Group was very persuasive, is often cited throughout the country for strong evidence that within just a decade, 80%, not 5%, not 25%, but 80% of fueling stations will be unprofitable. And the chance that we might have derelict or abandoned gas stations is really something of great concern from a land use perspective. Gas stations are a challenge from a land use planning perspective because they're relatively small commercial lots. They have a large environmental impact, and they're dispersed throughout the city. So from a planning perspective, the commission suggests that really our first priority is to not see a further expansion of the number of these or an increasing concentration. And if new ones are added, then those are the separations that we're suggesting. I think the key finding that we'd like you to focus on tonight as council is that the current code talks about some separation, but it really only focuses on the traffic conflict issue, whereas the evidence really suggests that this is a health issue more than anything else. I also wanted to note that a question was raised regarding the part of our recommendations that have to do with electric vehicle charging stations. And I think it is a legitimate question to ask, or council to ask, about whether or not gas stations alone should have the requirements that we are suggesting. We do think, the commission certainly thought it's part of our recommendations because we believe there is a basis for distinguishing gasoline stations as transit refueling stops to have special requirements related to vehicle charging. But we also understand that the council may find that you want them to be applied more broadly than just in gasoline stations. I'll just wrap up by saying that, the most interesting question, I think, from a planning perspective is kind of where do we go from here? Because our job is to look to the future and see what's going to happen. I think in the video we mentioned that in just 20 years, you saw this massive transition in the early 1900s from horses to cars. And literally there were 450,000 cars in 1900 and 21 million horses. By 1929, there were 23 million cars and there were virtually no horses in the urban environment. The first places that got converted to gas stations in that transition period were old horse stables. And that lends, I think, it's an interesting lens to think about how we might be looking at locating alternative fuel stations in the future, because that transition may happen even more quickly. And with that, happy to take any questions that council may have.
Thank you, Mr. Kolkmeyer. Just real quick before we jump in, see a lot of hands, I want to just make sure to note for the record that Councilor Mayotte Guerrero is here. And one more reminder just about what we're hoping to accomplish today. It's a study session, so we can't take any formal action. We can make a direction based on consensus to staff to place a resolution on recommendation for a future council item. And we can also make a recommendation if we so choose to direct staff to draft an ordinance, because we can't take action at a study session. So this is more of just a conversation. And with that, Councilor Over, you had your hand up first.
Thank you. I've got a long list. And by the way, I've got to say at the beginning, I love it when people call me Rich. And this is this is not really a formal setting to me. So I'm going to say Kip. Kip, you were saying that, no, I'm going to preface this by something else. Back when I was young, before gas hoses are clicked off automatically, we used to stick our heads down next to where you stick the gas in and listen to the gas filling. And when it went, then you clicked off and you went off. I don't do that anymore and haven't done that for a very long time because I'm very much aware of the danger of the gases coming out of there, the airborne gases, separate from gasoline. But I think we really need to say where or why, or who says is the right word, gasoline causes serious adverse health effects. So can you address that? Is it the EPA that says it's cancerous? Is it European groups? Who is it?
Sure. And obviously no member, thank you, Councilor Over. The Planning Commission are not healthcare experts. And we rely upon the information and testimony that was brought to us. We'll note that there's a Columbia University study that was funded by the Department of the Environment that drew a direct link between ethylbenzene and a significant increase in cancer risk. There's a Johns Hopkins study that found a dramatic increase in childhood leukemia that came from exposure to gasoline. From the folks who testified before us, it was quite clear that there are ample sources. There did not seem to be any question that there are hazardous chemicals related to gasoline itself and the dispensing of gasoline. And then the other important health effect, which obviously is indisputable, is air quality. Because the cars, petroleum, carbon-based cars that drive down the road pollute the air. And therefore, encouraging those or having them concentrated has a direct effect on air quality for us all.
Yeah, I don't doubt any of that, but I thought it needed to be asked. But the question is then, who are we trying to protect here? Is it the neighbors, or is it the people going to fill up their cars at the fueling stations? Is being in a fueling station, filling up your car, just standing there like we all do, is that dangerous and that's who we're trying to protect? Or is it mostly the neighbors that we're trying to protect?
Yeah, again, thank you. That's an excellent question. It's everybody. So for the neighbors that live nearby, they're having a continuous exposure, so they need to be protected. For all of us that are out breathing the air or affected by it need to be protected. And even those individuals that are pumping their gas was very interesting. There's a 2020 study that found that even with a vapor recovery system installed on every pump, 80% of the fumes are still off-gassed, and those are carcinogenic fumes. So it really is protection for all three.
And yeah, great. But you mentioned my next question is like, okay, we used to have a system to catch gas. I mean, there were the big hoses, that were around the hose, the metal hose in the middle and the big rubber hose around the outside. And it was around for a little while, like 3-4 years. I mean, it appeared everywhere and then disappeared everywhere. It was obviously an attempt to capture those gases that were coming out of your tank, really. Whatever happened there? Do we know?
And I want to be careful because others may know definitively. I did ask that question at our hearing, aren't there mechanisms to capture those vapors that would make us safer? And I think the answer was that they were not effective systems. And that 2020 study is a good example, even with a vapor recovery, which I think is what you're describing.
Yeah.
It did not capture, it only captured 20%.
Right. So it's extra cost and it didn't do any good. So, yeah, that makes sense. All right. I've got one more, and it's my biggest one. And I have other questions, but I think I should let other people talk. Okay. So what is the end result of what you're proposing? What's the end result going to be? And I want to lead the witness here because I think you're going to have less gas stations farther apart. Or at least gas stations farther apart, fuel stations, but gas is easier to say. So that's it, right? Is basically we want to have more separation between the fuel stations and less of them. Yes.
I think that is a hope, though I will tell you, you have to be cautious about how effective this particular change would be. Any existing gasoline station would be a legal non-conforming use, potentially, which means that there is not authority to shut any station down. No. So what we're really talking about is the expansion. And if a filling station were to be discontinued, then a new one coming to that location would have to meet the new requirements.
Right. And so this is my biggest fear from this, is that we're going to do the exact opposite of what we want to do, is that I see going forward, we will wind up with mega gas stations, giant gas stations, because, we're trying to save, okay, we don't want them close. And so the demand for gasoline isn't going to drop. I mean, I'll challenge that 80% later, but We're trying to build everything we possibly can build right now because so many people are coming in, and they're coming in with their cars. I don't see the demand dropping at all in the near future. And so the demand is going to be there, and we're going to want less gas stations. So basically what's going to happen is that they're going to build bigger ones. And then there's going to be mega gas stations and 20 pumps or something like that. You can see those things along highways right now. And I think that will actually concentrate our problem and our gas problem. And instead of like going into a place that has 6 pumps, 8 pumps, and 6x gas, air pollution problem. Let's call it air pollution problems. We'll have 20x air pollution problems, and it'll just actually go backwards from what we really want to do, which is to have less. And so, I mean, something that I've heard for a long, long time is that the solution to pollution is dilution. You probably heard it too. And so I think we're like actually concentrating our problem here, or attempting to, instead of dispersing. I think, if we really wanted to protect the people coming in to get a gas, to fill up, we would rather actually have a lot of dispersed stations with 4 pumps or something like that. So, you drive in, you fill up, and it's really not a big deal. Whereas otherwise, you're going to drive in, and there's 20 pumps, and the gas, you won't be able to see it, but the air quality around those pumps is going to be absolutely horrible. And so I think we might be going down the wrong road here. And along that line, when you were talking about electric charging stations, that I don't think anybody wants to hang out at a gas station, because I hear that the air quality there is not the best in the world. So I'm not loving the idea of requiring charging stations there. If they want to do it, that's fine. But requiring it seems like a counterproductive. And I'll let that go and come back later. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Stewart.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on something that you just mentioned. It was my first question anyway, so that worked super well. Was existing gas stations who then potentially go out of business or sell, what are the circumstances under which you envision them having to apply for a new special use permit, and where would we find that requirement?
Thank you, Councilor. I'm actually going to defer to Mr. Rice on that. The general notion is that if it's a continuing use, this new requirement wouldn't be applicable, but I will defer to Mr. Rice.
Right. So if a fueling station exists, it can continue to exist. Could be bought and sold, so it can change from one. Trying to think, it could go from Shell to the one with the big green dinosaur. So they could change hands. If it were discontinued for a period of, I need to check my ordinance, but I think it's 180 days. I think it's 6 months. Then it may not be able to be reused for a gas station, right? So it becomes, it goes beyond the kind of non-conforming use to where it's not been active, and they would have to, if it sat for too long, it would have to go back to Planning Commission to reuse that existing site. A Planning Commission for a special use permit to reuse that existing site for a fueling station. I don't see that necessarily happening. Most likely they're going to change hands, continue to update the facilities and so forth, especially if they're limited circumstances where they could locate in Lakewood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And then just a question about how we arrived at those specific distances, and then something that I would ask for if we were to move forward. So it doesn't have to be answered right now, but just flagging that this is something that would be really helpful in this conversation if we moved forward, would be just based on the additional restrictions that are proposed in this red line version of the zoning code, if we could get a map of where then in the city these both car washes and gas stations would still be allowable theoretically under these new provisions would be really, really helpful, just to give us kind of a scope of what this is going to actually functionally do. But how do we arrive at the distances?
Thank you, Councilor. First of all, we don't have that map. I don't believe, Mr. Rice, we have that map prepared, but I don't think that would be difficult. And you've hit on a key thing. It is not just the distance, but it's also whether or not that is a district that's appropriate for a fueling station. So you got to think of those two things in combination, and that's why that map would be particularly helpful. As it relates to the distances, the truth is, very often in zoning, there's a certain arbitrary aspect to it. You try to tie it to something that is real world. And because we found that the vast majority of gas stations are roughly are within the 6 blocks, that's roughly half a mile. That's why the distance between them is 2,640 feet. It is half of 5280. And on the residential, we actually distance of a quarter mile, which is 3 blocks. We had some different information about how close and how far away. I would say that if we're erring on the side of it being a little bit farther away. But it seemed like the health concern justified that. But roughly that separation is a quarter mile. The separation between fueling stations is a half mile.
Thank you.
Councilor Maya Guerrero.
I had a similar question in terms of like where things would end up. I think one, potential problem of leaving gas stations and car washes under special use permit is just there's like slightly less control about the zoning. So I don't think we have to have an exact answer there, but I would appreciate when this comes to council to either have answers about or potential language to think about like removing the ability for gas stations to be built in like some of the just wanting to really protect that they're not going to get built into like other residential places. Like if they're getting pushed off of some of the main corridors, I don't want there to be this potential for folks to try to like use that other use, like special permit potential places. Sorry, I said the word potential a lot. And then one of my other questions is, Ward 2, I think, is one of the places where this helps to be inspired. And thank you, Councilor LeBure, for spurring this action. Because we have seen gas stations get built like since the first round of regulations, and I'm very happy to get to be able to discuss this and like take a more aggressive action on this. But I will also say that Ward 2 has a very serious lack of groceries. And one of the pieces of feedback that I've actually gotten from a fair amount of folks was when the Quick Trip went in, which is known for having a little bit better quality food than other gas stations, that was actually helpful. And so I wonder, not necessarily for something even as small scale as a Quick Trip, but I know that we've been like the place on 10th and Sheridan used to be a grocery store and now isn't. And so I'm just like aware that this is a continued issue in my area, that we end up with gas stations, even if, but what we actually need is food, right? And so given that King Soopers, Safeway, both have fuel pumps, they have gas stations associated with them, at least the ones that I go to, would that business model like be counted as a fueling station and then therefore also have this as a potential barrier? And if so, I would like to see probably an exception. I don't know if grocery stores just have a specific legal definition already, or if it's about certain percentages that are from groceries. Because again, I'm not actually looking at like a Quick Trip style, but I just got so much of that feedback from folks when that went in.
Thank you, Councilor. I would suggest just a couple of things. First of all, to your first point, our recommendations do include excluding two zoning districts that currently gas stations could go into. So that's the mixed use neighborhood and the mixed use general, because those are supposed to be encouraging non-automobile transit primarily. So I think in terms of this pushing into other areas, we do not believe that would be a concern. But your other point is a very important one. I don't know from a planning perspective if it would make sense. We haven't looked at that in terms of dealing with the food desert issue. It's a very serious issue in a lot of places. My personal view, but this is beyond what the Planning Commission recommendations were, is that it would be difficult to justify a fueling station because of the additional food opportunities. We would be better served by trying to incentivize places where there are food deserts and not have a fueling station. But I'm sorry I don't have a more complete answer on that. It was a little bit outside our scope of what we looked at.
All right, I have a follow-up. I want to be really clear to signal to other counselors and to staff that I think that either more information at the very least about that, but I think if others are comfortable with the idea of like proper grocery options potentially being like accepted or workarounds, like that is just something I'd want to see some options for, because to Councilor Ulver's point about unintended consequences, that's one that just worries me just a touch. And then lastly, on electric vehicles or electric charging, I wanted to say that I like requiring charging stations. We are going to need more of that infrastructure. I know that I would really definitely want to ensure that that is something that is getting like evenly applied across, no matter what then the permitting process ends up being, or other requirements that we end up having, or scale of a new fueling station, et cetera. But to me, I think that that's a really great component of this. I wanted to say that out loud as well.
And just for further clarification, all gas stations right now, like every commercial business that has required parking, does have a certain percentage requirement to have parking spaces be equipped for electric vehicles. What's different in this recommendation is the level 3 charger, really, because there is some good evidence that individuals that are doing the rapid charge, and assumptions are that technology is going to continue to improve, but even now, the average stop at a gas station to fill up for gas is like 9 minutes. And the average time for someone to fill up with a supercharger to get them to the next place they need to go is like 13 minutes. So a lot of the superchargers to go from 20% to 80% are more like 20 minutes. And that may be too long to stay there. But if you're looking for that quick boost to get home or something, then that might fit the bill.
Yeah, I'll just share too. I mean, I had years of working on electric vehicle and like transportation policy, and for folks that maybe like haven't been in the weeds on that, I want to share that the level 3 charging, it does take also more infrastructure. And so thinking about wanting that to be predictable, people to be prepared, Excel to be prepared, like also all makes sense. So I think from a customer perspective, but also from just the long-term sustainability of these places, that is also really important. So appreciate that being in there. And then I also just wanted to, well, no, I'll leave it for now. I'll come back. We'll see if it comes up another place.
Councilor LeBure.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I just want to thank Mr. Rice, and I want to thank Kip, our Planning Commissioner Chair. Sorry, I was looking for you on the screen. I just want to thank you for all your work. Really appreciate you guys looking into this, and the commission looking into this. This is something that is important to me, and I know it's important to a lot of our community members, or I know a lot of them are frustrated, with the number of fuel stations that have sort of jumped up in the last few years. And obviously, it's something that's not unique to just Lakewood. City of Denver is now looking at similar kind of regulations as well. And one of their reasons, of course, that they've talked about is making sure that they're building walkable communities, and really that they're sort of meeting the expectations that they set out for in their planning strategies. And so, for me, this is also an important part of this regulation, is to make sure that, our MGU, I think this is one thing that a lot of people haven't picked up on in the community as much, is the important changes of which zoning districts these fuel stations would be allowed in. And the MGU is a huge one. That's obviously a lot of Colfax is really zoned that way. And this would make sure that we're protecting those areas for being able to be developed with housing, which we all know is an important need for the community and the region and for the city. And so to me, these are really great regulations. And the fact that we're pushing them into the commercial zoning districts is the big thing to note here. Because we've messed around with distance requirements in the past. I don't think we went far enough, and so I think really changing which zoning districts that these would be allowable in is a huge change. And I work for an air quality agency, and we do a lot of work in this space. And I've seen a lot of interesting things like infrared camera videos of all the pollutants coming out and hitting people while they're sitting there refueling their cars. So now I step away whenever I'm refueling mine, because I don't want to be just ingesting benzene and toluene and ethyl benzene and all that stuff all day while I'm refueling. And the other thing with this, and sorry to opine for too long, but I just want to make this point, is that these are stationary sources that have pollutants emitting into the atmosphere. And with these kind of heat, the reason you're seeing these ozone alerts every single day is because all these pollutants are going up into our atmosphere. They're getting trapped behind the mountains and they're getting baked by the sun. And that's why we're having all these ozone problems. And that's why we're not going to make our federal standards in the next couple of years. So putting more and more of these stationary sources that have leaks and is part of our regional problem. It's why we're going to have new federal regulations. And that's why the state is clamping down. Part of the reason that inspired me to really do this is because I went to a CDPHE symposium last year on air quality, and one of the major sources of leakage or rogue emissions is from all these evaporative emissions in these kind of facilities. So this is important work. Thanks for leading on this and giving us a great presentation. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to make sure I hit on, but I think I'll just leave it at that. So thanks a lot. Thanks again. And I want to thank the council for taking a look at this.
Councilor Sinks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it was interesting to hear 52 gas stations in the city. I wonder if you know how many are in the MN and MG zones. Do you have a feel for maybe like a fourth, a half? You don't have to give me an exact number.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Mr. Rice would have a guess on that. And I think that it's a really good question to match up the districts, and we can certainly do that. The approach from the Planning Commission was really more conceptual and wasn't looking at the existing ones in their particular locations. It was more what would be an appropriate one. So I apologize, we don't have that.
No, that's okay. Just curious. And yeah, thank you so much for all of your work and the health benefits. I do also have to bring the corner of Kipling and Colfax, where you have a gas station on every corner. And so in addition to the health benefits, it's like also, really? Another one's going up? Another, went up when they were being built. It's like, oh my gosh. And I think a lot of people thought that is pretty much overkill. So I do appreciate also the distance requirement as well. So thanks. That's all I have.
Councilor Ryan.
Thank you for this great presentation. And Councillor Mayak Guerrero raised a great point that I also had on my list about the food desert concerns, especially in certain parts of our cities. Where I came out on this, and I was hoping you can opine on this, or maybe someone from city staff can opine on this, is that there's still the option of applying for a variance. It's not a ideal situation, but it prevents us from being in a situation that if we adopt this, that's an absolute barrier to certain certain grocery stores from moving in if they don't meet the limit. Is that a fair statement?
Not the variance. We're not allowed. The state of Colorado doesn't allow for use variances, so they could rezone a piece of property, or it, if it was a grocery store and they were looking at having as part of the development fuel stations, that might be an option, but they wouldn't be able to go through the variance process.
Okay, but there's some process, whatever that label is, that might allow. I mean, again, not ideal because it does provide a little bit more of an obstacle, but
there is a public process, yes.
Oh, okay, good. So I wanted to touch on the EVs, and certainly anything that we can encourage more EVs in the city, I think is generally a good thing. I wonder, is there a general policy that either staff or planning commission is aware that the city has adopted as to how we go about who's going to be putting up EVs and a requirement in a systematic plan as opposed to a hodgepodge here and there?
So with new development, the EV charging stations are required to, so there's kind of two levels. With new development, there's a requirement for a certain number based on the size of the development, and then an additional percentage needs to be EV compatible. So as you're building the infrastructure, you've got to run essentially conduit so that you could, in the future, expand the number of EV parking spaces that you provide. So there's kind of two levels. There's those that actually have to go in, and then those that could be expanded in the future. And that's for new development. From I'm not the best person to speak to this. It was the sustainability group. They're looking at EV and how that's allowed. I don't know that we have a systematic plan in place that for EV, for instance, going into the rights of way. So they would be placed on public property, or getting existing developments to come in to retrofit to add those facilities. I know some of the grocery stores are adding them, right? Their customers are coming there and they're partnering with, and I think that's where Lakewood's at right now. There certain types of businesses are partnering with the charging facilities that are out there.
Is the gas station requirement as proposed, is it consistent with our existing policy, or is it different from the existing policy?
I would say that I do think this recommendation, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, is farther than would be required otherwise. So it was meant to look at the use of a fueling station and say that if we're transitioning to different types of fuel, then perhaps it should be a higher standard. So this, I think we certainly understood this to be a recommendation to have a greater requirement on new gas stations for EV charging.
This is a question for our legal representative. Will we be receiving further information as to whether the requirement as proposed meets the constitutional thresholds or not?
Provide that information. One, in researching what other cities are doing, many other cities who have EV charging requirements, they are not specific to a specific use or business. They are usually requiring certain EV requirements in zone districts, or per number of parking spaces, or in some cases like City of Boulder and elsewhere, they're requiring it for all new non-residential construction. So what we can present to City Council, because this is a recommendation from the Planning Commission, we can also present something whereby we could, amend the, have a further zoning code amendment to basically require this for new construction types. We could do it for certain zone districts. We could do it with, again, per number of parking spaces, however City Council wanted to address that.
So it's been my understanding that there is a significant concern, at least, that's worth further discussion on the legal requirement of mandating EVs for gas stations. And so what I would suggest is that we have a greater conversation, and perhaps we send it to the Planning Commission back for helping us come up with, working with the Sustainability Department on a larger plan for EVs across the city, whether that's multifamily units, apartment units, or commercial units, shopping centers, otherwise, consistent with some of the things that our legal counsel just listed out as some examples, non-exhaustive list, of course. That would be my suggestion with respect to EVs. I'm in support of the rest of the proposal. I just have concerns about the legal ramifications on the EV requirement as it pertains just to gas stations.
Okay, Councillor Cruz.
Hello all. Thanks for the robust discussion so far, and to Chair Kochmeyer and to Mr. Rice for all of your work, and to the Planning Commission. This is certainly something that I heard a lot about on the doors across the district, and I'm really pleased that we are getting to have a conversation about. So the first thing I wanted to ask about was how you all picked those specific codes within the mixed use zones, because I think I heard a lot of complaints from folks near the Alameda area as well, with some of the car washes and other types of infrastructure that were there. And I think that there was like MC or other types of mixed use zoning down there that I wasn't totally sure if they were representative. So I just wanted to kind of understand how that fits into the larger conversation, like other types of the mixed use zones.
Thank you, Councilor. And that is, again, a great question. One of the things we have to be cautious about from Planning Commission perspective, and I think from City Council, is we cannot do spot zoning. We're not supposed to look at an individual property and say, how do we change what's on that property? We're supposed to focus more on kind of the conceptual notion. And that is the reason for the districts that we're suggesting currently. For fueling stations, they are only allowed as special uses in certain districts. We're suggesting that there should be fewer districts, but that's not done with an eye towards a particular station at a particular intersection. It's more the general way that that area has been characterized under our zoning map.
Yes, totally appreciate that. Let me rephrase my question. Maybe it didn't come across the way I meant it to. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are different mixed use zones beyond the ones you all selected that I do think do represent area. Is that correct, or are those the only ones? Because I was seeing like MCU and other ones.
Yes.
Okay.
There are other districts. Yeah, there are other mixed use districts. Yeah.
Great. And so I guess my question is, why were those districts not included in the conversation when the general idea of mixed use districts is the kind of argument you all are making around the other areas with regard to trying to create like higher density transit oriented development?
Great. And I apologize if I misunderstood the first time. Yes, there are a number of mixed use districts, and Paul is going to be able to speak more authoritatively than I am, but they are mixed use districts that have different focuses. Are they meant to be mixed use that people from the neighborhood walk to? Are they ones that they mainly walk to but sometimes drive their car to? Or are they a mixed-use district that really people are driving from Denver to get there? I think we even have a mixed-use employment district where we say it's mixed use, but what happens here is really focused on the employment by the individuals within that district. The ones that we're suggesting be excluded are the ones that are less automobile focused and more pedestrian focused. That's the rationale for it.
Right. And the other thing with the mixed use district is design. So some of the fueling stations were allowed in those districts, but there are additional design requirements that are difficult to get to that kind of regulate if a fueling station makes sense in those other mixed use districts. For instance, you did mention the C that allows for that. We didn't, when we were looking at placing the uses, we didn't want to not allow something. We did this in 2012 and looking forward. But the design requirements, you're not really going to build a gas station the way you would build a building in the MC. Somebody may come up with something creative, or we haven't seen a fueling station go in the C context, but we didn't want to prohibit it.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you both for that level of context. And the other question that I had was maybe with regard to like current regulations. I think a concern, particularly if we're thinking about walkability, bikeability, all of those things, like sometimes the times I feel most unsafe are like walking next to a gas station and people are turning in or turning out or like doing a whole bunch of things. And same honestly with car washes. And so I'm curious if it came up in the discussion at all, thinking about how people move within and around some of these areas in our residential or other types of corridors.
I would defer to you, Paul, on that. It wasn't specifically discussed on the commission, but certainly that is an issue for all types of development where you might have the interface between pedestrian and automobile traffic.
Right, and with existing conditions, they're there, and so I don't know that it was something that came up, or even I was thinking about, because when a new fueling station comes in, we start to apply the current standards as they relate to transportation and access and pedestrian circulation and so forth. And so the newer stations, there's a lot of traffic going in and out just by the type of facility is. These facilities are generally located on larger roadways where there's a lot of traffic, but the pedestrian and the vehicle circulation patterns are designed to be safer than some of the existing conditions you may be thinking of.
Okay, that's helpful. And maybe would like to get maybe some further information about that, or as we think about kind of next steps in the ordinance, kind of if, further ones are going to be built, what is that going to look like in terms of the impact on transportation, the vulnerable road users in the area. And then I think the final thing that I'll just mention with response to like the conversation around food deserts and grocery stores, I totally appreciate that being brought up and is a really important angle. I would love to talk through that more because I think the quality of food, affordability of food, all of those types of things are really important concerns that can have really disproportionate impacts if we're relying, which I know everybody knows, like on communities if we're relying on those as our food sources. And also I think, there's many King Soopers and Safeways and other things that don't have gas stations. And so would love to just kind of think about within the business model or within thinking about how we incentivize bringing more options for fresh food into the area, like how we can do so in a way that doesn't, potentially leave us with areas that are going to need to be remediated in 10 to 20 years.
Thank you.
That's so nice, John.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I had to change PCs and for some reason my conference call puck decided to quit right before the call. So to follow on what Councilor Cruz just said, it was brought up to me in discussions about this particular topic with different people in the or different constituents was that there was a discussion or a follow-up on convenience stores, an ordinance around convenience stores that came up several years ago, and I don't know who was on, Kip, whether you were on planning commission at the time or whatever, but I don't think that was ever brought forth. So maybe if someone could follow up on that, it would be great. And I agree, there's a definite difference in between a convenience store and a grocery store. And, so just as a footnote. And I guess in terms of, I don't know how many people on this call actually own an EV. We own one. And I can say that absolutely for this purpose, for gas stations, for convenience stores, grocery stores, and new construction, we need to absolutely include EV chargers, and they need to be a level 3 charger. Because, Kip, to your point, that sometimes you can use those things as an extra boost if you're traveling somewhere or you're just trying to get home. But when we're building high density housing or whatever format is being built, if we're going to try to incent people to purchase EVs, we need more access to charging stations. I've seen more and more of them been able to utilize them going into the mountains and different parts of the state, but they should be a prominent feature in the city itself for all the reasons that were already mentioned. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be considered. And again, going back to the ozone alerts, people have all kinds of misconceptions about electric vehicles, and there's been a lot of misinformation spread about them. But the fact of the matter is they definitely reduce your emissions. And they are much more affordable now than ever between the infrastructure bill, the incentives that are out there from a federal and state perspective, and hopefully we can build on that momentum. I think that's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Lowe.
Thank you, and excited to see this on the agenda. For sure, I've heard about this from a number of folks in Ward 3. So, Mr. Rice and Commissioner Kolkmeyer, thanks so much for the work teeing this up, as always. Commissioner Kolkmeyer, you've already spoken to this a fair bit today. There's been a couple of questions about this, but I just wanted to tee this up one more time. Clearly, there's an interest. It's important. First of all, I'm generally in support and supportive of these recommendations. So look forward to seeing this hopefully come in front of council. Also would echo what's been said about interested in some flexibility to make sure that this isn't a barrier for sort of local grocery stores. Have some sympathy to that point, but supportive more broadly of this moving forward. Clearly, we want to make sure that this doesn't somehow create a problem for current fully operational fuel station and car washes. You've already spoken to that. Could you just lay out one more time the mechanism by which this doesn't disrupt operations for current existing incumbent gas stations, but is only targeted for new entrants or folks that maybe are decommissioned and then reapply for a special use permit? Could you kind of lay that out one more time for us?
Absolutely, Councilor. And I think a lot of times there's a misunderstanding about that. The assumption is that once the law changes, all property owners need to get into compliance. For zoning purposes, generally speaking, you are allowed to continue your use, but if you suspend the use or end the use, and as Mr. Rice mentioned earlier, and that did sound correct to me, that it's roughly a 6-month period of time, then you are required to come back and make the case again. But because of the protection of property rights under the law, where you can't use a new regulation to compel a existing legal business to close. And that really is a principle that underlies all of zoning. And we see this even as individuals property owners are seeking original approval, at some point, they get vested property rights in the continuation of the existing law. To change the law after someone, was legal and then is seeking it, is considered unfair or unconstitutional in different contexts. So that means that this is most impactful for the future, for new proposals, or if an existing use meets the definition of discontinued or abandoned.
So just to be absolutely crystal clear about this, just in case we get some questions or some pushback on this down the road, the recommendation here, the intent in saying this before council, and based on the conversations you've had with the city attorney's office, is none of these recommendations would negatively impact a current existing gas station or car wash with an active permit.
Right. They would be a legal, non-conforming use. Yes.
Got it. That's very helpful. I think, as this hopefully does come before council, I think maybe just some very simple language that spells that out in plain language, just a little bit more explicitly, would be useful, so that we can all point to that. And even if for someone that understands zoning law, it should be sort of an obvious point. I think just making sure that in the final ordinance that gets, I may be addressing this point a little bit more to the city attorney's office than to you, Commissioner Kolkmeyer. I think just making that really explicit would be useful. A final quick fun fact I hope council will indulge me on for 30 seconds or less. Just because it hasn't come up yet, there actually is an economic reason why gas stations tend to cluster. It's called Hotelling's law. It's an economic principle that similar businesses cluster geographically. It's why, if you can actually prove it using game theory, that if you have two ice cream stands on a beach, they're going to cluster and they're going to converge on the central point of the beach because they both want to serve half their clients. So there's an economic reason this is happening. I actually think that points to the wisdom of doing this. It points to the fact that, market conditions will actually continue to incentivize this natural clustering of gas stations along intersections. But that actually doesn't mean it's in the public interest, nor does it mean it's the sort of intersections or city that we want. And I think it actually highlights the importance of this and the need for this regulation, because otherwise I think this convergence of gas stations, so that we have intersections, with 3 of the 4 different corners occupied by fuel stations, that will actually continue to happen under economic law unless we take action. So thanks again for putting this forward, and I'm in support of it.
Thank you, Councilor. Before we start round 2, I just wanted to add one thing from myself. Ward 1 has 22,000 households, and we have 3 grocery stores, one of which is maybe about to leave. So to me, it is important that we have a conversation. I appreciated Councilor Cruz's point about not being dependent on convenience stores, but I think I'm talking for me about something different, primary versus secondary use. I would really like to see that to be part of the conversation, because we are desperate. We have food deserts in the north side of Lakewood, and I believe, Mr. Kolkmeyer, you talked a little bit about encouraging that and incentivize that, but because we don't tax food, and for all of the reasons, this to me feels like an easy way to ensure that we're not creating a roadblock to bring food security into the community. So I'd want to just make sure that that's something that we continue to think about. And with that, we'll start round 2, and Councilor Olver, you're up.
Thank you. I think I left off a major point. Kip, did the Planning Commission discuss limiting the size of new gas stations?
No, we did not. It was the testimony that we received was primarily focused on the proximity issue. You may have a excellent inquiry about whether or not the size would create concentration as well. I think that would be a more detailed discussion on the economics of constructing a station like that. It might be that you have a lot of pumps, but the overall usage is fewer. You're trying to, as a business, incentivize people to say, look at all these open pumps, come in, but the concentration may not be there. We just don't know. So I think it's an interesting theory that might be worth pursuing. But we know that concentration can be addressed by separation.
Right. And I was talking about the law of unintended consequences. So maybe we get into larger gas stations, but it seems like the trend is already to go to larger gas stations. I mean, I've seen them. Well, of course, you see them on the highways a lot, and they're not empty. they are full. And I mean, on like I-80, I-70, 76, a few others, and I-70 goes right by here, and Sixth Avenue goes right by here, and so. Yeah, I've seen big ones and they're full. And then I think about the little one I go to with 4 pumps. And if that's a danger to me, then I think about, okay, somebody with 20 pumps and they're all running. They wouldn't run all day long, of course, but there'll be times. I think that we should include a limitation on the number of pumps, or at least talk about it. So I'm going to bring that up. And then some softball questions. You said the planning commission received public comments, and you invited expert testimony from the fueling station reps and the environmental groups. Who'd you invite, and did anybody show up? Who showed up?
Sure.
That'd be the right way to say that.
Yes. So the Petroleum Marketers Association is the primary association that represents gas stations. I reached out to them by phone and by email and did not receive any response, told them the exact hearing dates and encouraged them to come. Did the same thing with the Car Wash Association. And then there were, and you're testing my memory, I know we reached out to a couple of statewide environmental groups, but the folks who were most valuable to us, who we really are indebted to, is Clean Energy Lakewood. They came in, testified, brought a lot of information. So these are local folks who provided great testimony and took time to give us that information. So we owe a great debt to them.
Okay, thanks. That's about all I have for now. Thanks.
Councillor Sings.
Thank you. I hesitate to ask this. It kind of gets into the weeds, but just a follow-up with Councillor Lowe's, that conversation, and we said that current existing gas stations would not be harmed. One question that came up when you were talking about that was, what if, and we've all seen that gas companies, it's like, oh, now this is a Shell. Oh, now it's a Conoco. Now, how would that affect the legal non-conforming use?
So I'm going to quickly answer and then hand it to Ms. Stanek. The general rule is a change in ownership is not a change in use, but I will defer to the city attorney for further clarification.
Meyer is correct. If this is a change in ownership from one gas company to another gas company, and they intend to use it for the same purposes, the planning department, they would not need to come back with a new application, is my understanding, and Paul can correct me. So they would continue on with, simply rebranding and using it as a fueling station. Where there would be trouble, I suppose, is if this was, let's say a gas station was put on the market and it was, in essence, not used for a significant period of time while it was listed for sale. In that case, we get into, as both Chair Kochmeyer and Mr. Rice touched on, we get into that more than 180 days. And does this need to come back, be subject to the new standards? So if it's, and I'm guessing if a gas station company, and this is just speculating, but if they're intending to sell this to another gas station company for that use, they obviously want to ensure that they can operate as a gas station, because there'd be no other point in selling it to them necessarily unless they were going to retrofit it for some other fuel type, I guess you could say. So as long as there's not a gap and it's a continuing use, they would not need to come back with a new application. So there wouldn't be any concerns about Shell selling it to a Sinclair or a Quick Trip or anything like that. Certainly if they wanted to markedly change the site plan, so let's say they sell it to another gas station and then they want to do a lot of, different reconfiguration, new construction, then again, they could then be subject to the new standards.
Great. Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. I have one more point and then see if there's any last thoughts. And then we'll move on. But I wanted to build a little bit on what Council Over was just saying. For us, we're in the forever business, not the now business. And I think there is some agreement with the majority of us that some of these fueling stations are hopefully going to be obsolete as we start to move to cleaner fuel. But we do know that the highway systems are where we're going to need the most fueling stations. And so that CL zoning district is right by the convergence of highways. It's right by 6th Avenue and I-70 and Colfax. And wondering if there is a consideration around that not being a special permitted use, but just a permitted use. So we sort of drive you see what I did there? We sort of move the fueling stations so that they are closer to the highway system so that we're not having to retrofit them later. Was that a consideration that you all made?
We did not. It's a very good point, and we did not make that differentiation. The assumption I think we were operating under, and this may be persuasive or may not, is that in addition to our 52 stations all being within a relatively short distance to each other, we are in a much larger metropolitan area. And there are literally hundreds of options for folks right across our borders and along major interstates and highways and county roads and whatnot. So the specific answer is we did not consider whether or not there should be an easier method than a special use to approve in certain districts. But I could see how that could potentially be something to consider. Overall, though, the availability of these stations in Lakewood and our surrounding communities is ubiquitous. And therefore, there does not seem to be much concern about having a gasoline desert.
Councilor Nystrom.
Yeah, I guess just to follow on to that question and kind of, I'm not sure what the best approach would be on this, but has there been any kind of assessment or, I don't know, just an idea to have an assessment or a comparison for a city comparable to Lakewood, with how many gas stations we currently have, and relative to the population we have and the number of cars on the road, we're an infill city, right? We hear that over and over. How many gas stations do we need? And again, if we're not going to focus on including charging stations, and then we're going to have to deal with that down the road, that's a concern. But it's also, at what point are we maxed out on gas stations? Like I don't think I've ever heard from somebody that they're concerned that we don't have enough gas stations. So maybe that's something that can just be a follow-on analysis, I guess. Thank you.
All right. Well, Mr. Rice, Mr. Kochmeyer, there was a lot to discuss tonight, and I wonder, is there something that we need to return to? It sounds like there is acceptance from council that this is something we want to keep discussing, so move forward with that. There is some amendments and talking points that people brought up. Do you have what you need from us, or is there anything we need to go back to?
I don't want to speak for Mr. Rice, but I will. I think the direction that staff needs is whether or not these recommendations are something that you would like to see in ordinance form, with the understanding that, that's just the beginning of the process. If you choose to add to them or modify them or, take a totally different direction, that's obviously always in council's purview. I think it is the hope of the Planning Commission that these recommendations would move forward in whatever form the council is comfortable with. to affect this change sooner rather than later, because we do think that this transition is going to be here quickly, and we recommend these changes.
Right. And I heard some requests for additional information. So would that come back at a hearing, or would that is presented as part of the packet, or how would that work? A couple examples: map with fueling stations and car washes by zone district. Options for the limiting or not limiting food options in certain areas with the particular standards. Looking at some additional information on ped and vehicular circulation. And then use the allowing fueling stations in the CR zone district as well. So I don't know, that some of that is informational, and some of it is like new information that may add some additional discussion. So I don't know what you're actually looking for with those asks.
Ms. Hudson.
Yeah, I would recommend that we would do the two in tandem. So we have on one side, staff is actually answering those questions and providing some additional information by way of just a memo to City Council. And at the same time is constructing the language, working with legal, of course, for the ordinance itself. So on one hand, you're getting more information, answering the questions that were brought up today during this study session. And then you'll also see the draft written ordinance. Hopefully you'll read that in advance and be able to formulate whatever kind of questions you might have, modifications you'd want to make during the second reading. So I think we can do both at the same time, and I think that'll be really efficient.
Great, thank you.
And just a reminder, in the policies and procedures that we're adopting, we do have a third reading now available. So if there are a lot of amendments that come from this process, and it sounds like there might be, it's there is an extension of that process, and that's always been there, but we've just named that more formally. So
I think thank you for that clarification. I think that's really good. That way we can have more of a looser conversation on second reading if we want to make some more adjustments for the third and final. So thank you.
All right. Okay, with that, we'll move on to item 4. And again, I will defer to Mr. Paul Rice, the Development Assistance Manager, and Planning Commissioner Kip Kolkmeyer. It's my understanding there's not a presentation on this, but Mr. Kolkmeyer is available to summarize and answer any questions on the topic.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Unfortunately, you haven't been treated to a melodious video on this issue. I want to start by acknowledging both Mayor Pro Tem and Councilor Sinks. This was really the latest request they had made to try to create an opportunity for residents within Ward 1 who have some continuing concerns about defining residential use by a college or university. And I would say that this effort in one respect was very successful, but in an unexpected way. What the Planning Commission heard was that all of the parties interested in this question, and I'll describe what the question is in a moment, but the bottom line is all the testimony received by all interested parties was an agreement that we should not recommend changes to the definition of university and college uses contained in our zoning ordinance. Another little important caveat: the Planning Commission, and in fact the City Council as well, it has to look at these issues not in terms of a particular neighborhood or a particular college or university, but we have to look at that all of them together. What is the policy basis upon which our definitions are made, our zone districts are established and applied? So we understand that there is a long-term 20-year or more conflict in a particular neighborhood in Lakewood between neighboring residents and a particular institution. But the Planning Commission's job is to look at this as it would apply to any college or university and any neighborhood. We had 3 different hearings on this, and the issue was, should there be a change to the definition of what is a college or university use in our zoning ordinance? There's a history here of having even litigation over the question of student housing. And now there are questions about other types of university affiliated uses that are not on the campus itself, but are in the neighborhood next door. Commissioners had expected that interested parties would come to us and suggest definitional changes. And the reason we expected that was that we heard there were concerns that the current law was not leading to enforcement. However, what we heard in testimony from everyone was a single message over and over and over again. You do not need to change the definition. You need to have more enforcement. Now, the role of the Planning Commission is to recommend zoning code changes to the City Council based upon policy objectives. The City Council's job is to adopt those, reject those, modify and adopt them. And it has always been the case, remains the same, that code enforcement staff, advised by legal counsel, it's their job to interpret and enforce the code. Neither the City Council nor the Planning Commission have any role in interpreting or enforcing the code. We just simply lack that authority. So time and again, we challenged the folks who came before us to talk about the policy issues underlying this definition. Does it need to be changed? Does it need to be clarified? Maybe it needs to be narrowed. And probably the most poignant example of this was a discussion about workforce housing, because workforce housing has tremendous benefits. And it is something that from a land use perspective, I think everyone on the Planning Commission would strongly urge you to find ways to incentivize it. People living close to where they work cuts down on auto traffic. It eases parking problems. It's tied to increased economic development. It's healthier lifestyle. There are all kinds of benefits. So a lot of what we try to do is get all of the interested parties to focus, okay, student housing is clearly exempted. They cannot have student housing off campus. Is there a reason to prohibit workforce housing? Is there a reason to encourage workforce housing? What we heard back was unequivocal. It was the current definition should be maintained. The irony, of course, is that these 2 different groups have a different interpretation of that current language. But they did not disagree. They did agree that the definition should remain the same. And for that reason, that is the recommendation of the Planning Commission. A key thing to point out, and it came up a little bit in just our previous conversation. Land use, the zoning code does not regulate ownership. It simply does not. It regulates uses. So if a district allows a coffee shop, coffee shops are allowed. They're allowed if, Jane Smith is the owner. They're allowed if Starbucks is the owner, and they're allowed if a church is the owner. It's the use. So is the use compatible or not? It is quite clear to the Planning Commission that there is a group that feels that the use of someone affiliated with the university or employed by the university is a unique use. It is also true that the university believes that it is not a unique use, that whether or not it's a professor or a plumber or anyone else who works with or affiliated with the university, the use is residential. And in fact, we dealt with the particular example where we said there's a duplex. It's not on campus. It is zoned residential. And one side, a plumber who has never worked for the university lives there. On the other side, a plumber who works full-time for the university lives there. What is the difference in how those two are being used? And the commission is not weighing in any way on interpretation A or interpretation B. But what we heard was all interested parties both disagreed with each other about the definition and how it was to be interpreted, but did not want us to recommend a change. And therefore, that is what the Planning Commission has recommended. I hope that was clear enough. There's a lot of history on this issue that many members of City Council know far better than I. But the bottom line is 4 months ago when we held the hearings, this, based upon what was presented to us, is our recommendation to council, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for summarizing that 20 years of history. Appreciate that. Councilor Sinks, do you have a little more to add to that?
Not much more. Thank you, Chair Kolkmeyer, for being very succinct in that 20 years, as we just mentioned. And yeah, I am available to provide any further context, and we so appreciate all the counselors and the analysis that you'll bring to this. Of course, Mayor Pro Tem Sherazai and I, we've met with many neighbors, had lots of communication, and it's a very difficult situation. And so, yeah, and I haven't brought further context, but if you'd like me to, anyone ask any further questions, I will. But that's all. We just look forward to your analysis. Thank you.
Councilor Matt.
I will share that I think that Mr. Kolkmeyer's summary was fantastic, and I would just share that that this sort of question about, despite the sort of conflict dotted history that the neighborhood might is still feeling, that this point that is brought up about wanting to be really cognizant of our long-term impact with any potential changes. I obviously, based on that, feel aligned that we shouldn't do anything in this moment, and I think that that legal question will have to shake out over time and potential lawsuits, because that's what happens when there's legal questions. But I also do want to recognize a very important point, which is workforce housing is important. And no matter the history of a particular organization, I would be very, very hesitant to do anything that might reduce or jeopardize the ability for us to partner with companies, organizations, et cetera, in terms of being able to continue to invest in strategies like workforce housing that allow for some restriction of costs, and the ability for people to live near where they work, which is critical both for the economy, critical for those people, those families, those workers, and for the environment, because it reduces traffic. And so I appreciate that summary and that thoughtfulness very much, and wanted to reiterate just where I'm at on this, so that there's not, I assume that we will continue to talk about these things because, I think that the different angles, right, that the discussion is going to continue to take is not lost on me. But for me, that's where this has to shape.
And Counselor, to that point, despite the consistent recommendation of no changes at this point, this issue will be revisited in the ordinance rewrite, I think necessarily. So that is not that far off. And I thought it was quite interesting. One of the folks who testified specifically brought out that 4 similarly situated towns, Fort Collins, Greeley, Colorado Springs, and Golden, do not regulate as strongly as we do in Lakewood. So there is a bigger conversation to be had about the nature of regulation, I think, regarding institutions like this. And that will happen.
Councilor Nystrom.
Yeah, and again, thanks for the analysis. I spent quite a bit of time digging into this, and I had a number of conversations with constituents and citizens in different wards, and I agree that the ordinance shouldn't be changed, but this has already been litigated. I think that the question seems to keep popping up, like what is considered university use? From, everything that I read, everything that I heard is that, and Councilor Ryan's the lawyer here. I'm not trying to be a lawyer, but it was ruled on, it was determined that university use is not acceptable for houses here. Yet, and the university agreed that they were going to honor the ordinance. I think what's lacking is the enforcement of that ordinance. And, on the one hand, we're all talking about affordable housing, and in these instances, and I hear you, Commissioner Kochmeyer, on the workforce housing, but there's, there's checks and balances here as well. But, they've purchased residences after all of this was litigated. And the concern that I have is that they're going to continue to do that. Those are homes that are only accessible to people that are either going to the school or working for the school. Nobody else has access to that. My understanding is there's 2 or 3 units currently that are sitting vacant. And there were also units that were purchased in the past and knocked down and turned into parking. That's not helping our housing situation. And I guess from my perspective, if there's more clarity needed on what constitutes university use, then that's a discussion that needs to be brought forward from code enforcement. But if someone's living there and no one else has access to rent that home, and in many cases they have parking stickers that indicate they use or attend the university, I'm just not sure where the lack of clarity is on what's considered university use. And step back, let's just consider what the potential ramifications are for people in this neighborhood. The majority of the people on this call live in Lakewood. And I think we ought to be respectful of those that reside close to that university and or in the vicinity, because if we continue to allow the university to buy up properties, again, if they're not going to be fully utilized or no one else can access those properties to rent them, we're restricting usage by people that live in Lakewood and are looking for housing. So, thank you.
Yeah, and Counselor, just so we're clear, I don't think anyone on Planning Commission disputes anything that you said. We made our recommendation because the people from that neighborhood and the university asked us to make this recommendation. There was no equivocation. And I think you've seen in the Lakewood Speaks comments, there is a certainty that parties have that it is one way, and that's why they asked us not to change it.
Thank you.
Councilor Ryan.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that I struggle with, frankly, a number of you were kind enough to sit down and share with me the tortured history of all of this, and a number of community members that were kind enough to do so as well. And frankly, I was surprised when there was the opportunity to request clarification and it was declined, even after one of the commissioners suggested language that might clarify. Maybe some folks are saying that perhaps staff should have been weighing in on there or not. I don't know. But one of the things that I struggle with, so we have a definition of what constitutes a university, 17.04.02, and it lists a number of things, and then it has a catch-all for including but not limited to. So we know that all the stuff previous to that is a non-exclusive list, and I think everyone agrees on that. And at least one of the commissioners suggested that he was sympathetic to the definition that some of the community members were raising as to it. But as Mr. Kolkmeyer mentioned in one of the hearings, it's not their role to interpret or enforce these things, nor is it ours. The piece that I'm struggling with is we don't really know what the definition, what the city's position is on this. And I know this is a legal piece, and so I'm not expecting an answer right here in a public forum. But nonetheless, I would request from legal, either in the form of a memo or in terms of a meeting that would be protected by attorney-client privilege, something where we are provided with what the city's interpretation is of this language, especially with respect to faculty housing, and the basis for that position, just so we know one way or another. I mean, we're hearing that there's great policy reasons why workforce housing should be provided. We're hearing some good arguments as to protecting the neighborhood. Frankly, none of that matters until we know what the interpretation is. So before we can weigh in as to what the policy should be or shouldn't be, we have to understand what the city's current position is. And so I would suggest that before we take any action, that we have an understanding as to what the city's legal position is moving forward. And then we can discuss some of these larger issues that, frankly, that golden opportunity was missed in the Planning Commission. And I'm a little bit, I wish that had occurred so we could be having those larger discussions now as to whether those things should be included right now. But I think it's fair to say that we should have an interpretation so that we can understand why or why not faculty housing wouldn't be included amongst all of these other list of criteria before we have these policy decisions, because all these policy decisions are frankly irrelevant until we know what the stance is.
Thank you. Councilor LeBure.
I would just piggyback on what Councilor Ryan said and support having that conversation at some point, whether that's a memo or as he mentioned, executive session. So either one, but I just want to mention, I never get enough talking about this topic, so happy to do it.
Councilor Cruz.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody for the conversation, and to Commissioner Kolkmeyer for the great summation of what was many meetings and many years. So, upon the recommendation of a community member, I did go back and watch the meetings, and something that was coming up in the public comment was, we just need City Council to direct staff to enforce the ordinance. And you mentioned this in your beginning comments, but I just want to further dig into or just explicitly state, like, if the recommendation, which was very clear, was agreed on by all parties involved, who were interested in this in the community, like our role, if we're not making a policy change, does not necessarily apply to directing staff in this capacity. Is that correct?
Well, I want to be careful to not assume that I know your role better than you. You know your role better. I can tell you from the Planning Commission and all planning commissions under Colorado state law, there is no role to play in enforcement. It is simply not something that we have any authority to do. We do not render opinions about interpreting the code. We do not suggest that something should be enforced. We had a strange conversation among commissioners. If you watched all three hearings, you probably saw where there was one commissioner who really wanted us to put in the resolution that this provision should be enforced. Well, that's terrible policy because all laws are presumed to be enforceable and should be enforced. And as soon as we start to say this one really should be enforced and that one enforce it if you want, that sort of thing, that is a role that no planning commission should ever be engaged in. The traditional notion is planning commission recommends code changes, city council adopts code changes, code enforcement interprets code changes with the assistance of legal counsel. I understand the frustration for folks that feel that the interpretation is not going their way, and I don't know if it is or it isn't. It's just not something planning commission deals with. But I do know that the planning commission has no role in encouraging or discouraging enforcement. Our view is the zoning code is the law, and the law ought to be followed, but we don't interpret the law.
Councilor Miyakuro.
I want to follow up both on, I think, Councilor Cruz's question, but also Councilor Ryan's point about this question of interpretation. I think both recognizing that it is likely something that we would need to have, excuse me, like some level of attorney advisement on the interpretation and like more in-depth, likely privileged analysis about how this might be interpreted and what we think as a city and how that will impact what we do. Because I think, to me, the other question is not just like I certainly do think that catch-all is a catch-all. Other uses is ill-defined, and that's true, and that is often the point of that phrase. But again, it depends so much on the hypothetical specifics of like every single possible property use, et cetera, for that to make sense. So that level of detail, I think, becomes necessary, especially then when we talk or think about the other repercussions I was mentioning about, yes, this is specifically for a university. And so hopefully no matter how this discussion evolves, how this topic evolves, it will remain only for university specific use. Because again, my concern here about wanting to not prevent ourselves from saying that, let's say that Terumo decides that they want to invest in workforce housing for their workers. Then would we be potentially at risk of saying, if they do that and then they get money from their workers through rent or they're owning that land, but that is not zoned for business, right? It's only residential, then is that a use that can't happen in that zone, right? And so this is not actually asking all of those questions, but there's the potential for all of those questions to get opened up here. because of, I mean, the way that precedent can stack on itself, essentially. So I would say that if we want to continue to be, problem solving this, I'm very open to continue to talk about it. But I do think that there is some of this like legal minutia that means a ton, like more than in other cases, given the history, given the tenseness, and given those potential sort of unseen legal ramifications.
Before we go to second round, I just wanted to add a little bit. I was surprised by how the Planning Commission hearings went. And I know that there's been a lot of conversations with Councilor Sinks and I, but I predate that. I was on this neighborhood association board and I live in this neighborhood. And so I do think that for me, this is a unique situation. Like we should be thinking globally about university and college use across Lakewood. But I also think that there may be a conversation that we need. They did this on the east side. They purchased all the properties. They came to the city, asked for a rezone, and they're doing that same thing and with potentially that opportunity in the future. And so I think the neighbors ultimately want that see, and that may be a separate conversation. That's probably not something we can have here, but I think I don't know what else to do. Like I've asked for this to be clarified. The neighbors have asked for it to stay the same. Enforcement is not in our purview. I think that there is a conversation on how can we make sure that we protect the footprint of the neighborhood without expansion and annexation additionally from the college. So that would be one thing that I'd be interested in. I don't know, Ms. Danik, I imagine that that's not something you can talk to us about now, but if that's something that could be included in a memo for some of the stuff that maybe needed to take offline. We're having trouble hearing you.
Now?
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard the comments from at least 4 counselors tonight. So we will be preparing either a memo or we will be prepared to go into executive session if and when this resolution is set for a regular scheduled meeting. So I will ensure that either or both of those things happen.
Great, thank you. Councilor Nystrom, another question, comment?
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate your comments, Councilor Sherzai and Councilor Ryan, and Commissioner Kolkmeyer. Totally get it. Like it's not your job to enforce this. It's not the council's job. And I absolutely think that at this point, if it's controlled and operated by the university, then it's a university use. But if there is some interpretation other than that from the city, on the part of the city, which is impeding them from enforcing this ordinance, then that's where the clarification is needed. It's not really up to us, and it's not something for the Planning Commission to decipher. So I appreciate the clarification on that. I don't think it's on the citizens to come up with additional language to clarify this. I think it's pretty straightforward. So that's my only comment. Thank you.
Councilor Ryan.
Just real quickly, I would like to see or hear the information regardless of whether a resolution comes before us. I don't want to wait until a resolution comes to find out what the interpretation is, because maybe we need to be proactive on some policy discussions. So I would personally find it helpful to not have to wait until something comes up in the form of a resolution or not.
I think, sorry, just to clarify, that's that was what Ms. Stanek was saying. Like she is responding to the request for more information, regardless of the outcome of tonight. So she's hearing us and she's responding. Am I correct, Ms. Stanek, in that? Okay.
From the body is that there will be some sort of writing, probably an attorney-client privilege memo that is sent to the body by Ms. McKinney Brown, and then what we would do with that is also be prepared, though, because the resolution will have to be set for a regularly scheduled meeting since the body can't take action this evening. So if it's scheduled, then we would also be prepared potentially to go into an executive session if there are still follow-up concerns, interpretation, legal ramification, questions, things of that nature.
Great, thank you. So Counselor Stewart.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to clarify, there is no resolution. We're not moving forward anything.
Sorry, Counselor.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
That their resolution for recommendation or not resolution for recommendation, but they drafted basically a resolution that said no change. Both that resolution and the car wash fueling stations resolution will still need to be put on an agenda for a future regular city council meeting, just so you can all decide if you're going to approve the resolution, deny the resolution, or again, in the first instance, take up the draft code or ordinance amendments.
So right now we need consensus that we want to move forward the draft recommendation and understand that Ms. Stanek and her will be drafting additional information that will be given. So thumbs up, vote, not shake your head. Okay. All right. Okay, with that, we'll move. Oh, are you ready for your committee report, or you have a question on this? Councilor Cruz.
Sorry, just from a
Okay,
procedural
so with
standpoint.
that, we're going to go ahead and move to item 5, the reports, and Councilor Cruz. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had a question about the other thing.
Did you
but
have
it is
enough?
not. I think
Go
I'm
ahead.
having internet issues. So I had a question about the other thing, but it's not super urgent. It was more of a procedural question. So it's fine.
I think go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with moving the resolution forward. I just wanted to understand, like, because it was a planning commission resolution, we have to vote on it. Just to be clear, if people ask us why we were voting on a resolution, to say we're not going to change anything.
Request.
Ms. Stanek, we're having trouble hearing you.
I apologize. Can you all hear me now?
Yep.
All right. Because there was a legislative modification request and the Planning Commission did draft a resolution, even though the recommendation was for no change. Both resolutions for these legislative modifications will have to be scheduled for a future regular meeting where the body can formally take action, even if that is to take no action, but just to vote on the resolution, since we can't do that this evening. But I understand there's also, we will, in the first instance with car wash and fueling stations, there will also be a draft ordinance prepared, as well as some information prepared for the body on those follow-up questions. For the secondary issue of university college uses, there will be a privileged attorney-client memo provided to the city council prior to that public hearing. So there will be information there, and then there will also be an opportunity to go into executive session if needed.
Councilor Sinks, did you have something? No. Okay.
No.
All right. Final call on this item. Okay. All right. With that, we'll go ahead and move to committee reports. Councilor Mayotte Guerrero.
Thank you. The Housing Committee had a very productive meeting last week where we were able to have a conversation with our wonderful CFO about the potential creation of a cost center, which is essentially a way for us to view and therefore learn about, and hopefully therefore in the future better target and spend strategically on housing. Affordable housing and eviction prevention was two of the biggest things, but there was a very long conversation with all of the various items that we want to see within that. And it led us to talking about our next steps. We have scheduled out our meetings and we'll be working to get them posted. The next meeting will be about inclusionary zoning. This is our first, not the first time that it's ever been talked about at the Housing Committee, Housing Policy Commission, but it will be an opportunity to hear about what other cities are doing that might be successful. And we will start to set some ideals around what inclusionary zoning would be able to look like, what is possible, reasonable, but also will affect change here in Lakewood. And so looking forward to that discussion. And I want to also just say that there has not actually been public comment. So we have had open public comment for a few different sessions. I know that housing is something that's very important to people. And so what I ask, I think, is that for all of you who are not on the commission, make sure that if you're hearing specific concerns and questions, etc., over the next month, to let me know. I'll really do my best to have some of that public sentiment reflected into the record on your behalf. I recognize that there is a majority of council already reflected there, but I wanted to put out really specifically that it's going to be about inclusionary zoning. So if you have questions and concerns about inclusionary zoning, if your community has questions and concerns about inclusionary zoning, this is a good time to be paying a little bit more attention. I'm actually not sure at this juncture if this next meeting will have open public comment. I need to finish the agenda thinking over the next couple of weeks. And the only reason we wouldn't is in order for there to be just a deeper discussion on with the experts that will be there, and then we would make time before we make decisions for there to be community input, like in a more formal way. So that is my main report from the Housing Policy Committee.
Councilor Stewart.
Hello. Just wanted to give a quick update that your Budget and Audit Board met last week to discuss the most recent findings of the community survey. Thank you so very much to Councillor Lowe for joining us on that and getting to hear some of the input before we bring our recommendations to the full council for our meeting next Monday. So really excited to have that discussion, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the Budget and Audit Board's recommendation before our action that is scheduled for a vote on Monday.
All right, Councilor Sinks.
Thank you. So the Head Start Committee, we suspended any meeting in June and July. So our last meeting was May 21st. And so I have nothing new to report, except that we have our next meeting August 20th at 5:30. So if our other council members that are on the Head Start meeting would put that on your calendar, since it's been quite a long time since we've met. So great. Thanks very much.
All right, and two real quick from me. Screening committee will be convening at the end of this month. I just want to thank the patients. We've got quite a few applicants that have been sitting in the queue for a while now, so we're excited to get through that. And then for the Denver Regional Council of Governments, a lot of us will be attending an event on August 28th, and I'm happy to share that our own city manager, Kathy Hodson, will be receiving a Distinguished Service Award, which recognizes those who have made the Denver region a great place to live. So great job to Ms. Hodson, and we're excited to celebrate that work later this month. And with that, I see no further business. So I'll adjourn the study session at 8:58 p.m.